Well, good afternoon and welcome to another episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts. We continue our current series, Cities of the New Testament. And in our last episode, you recall, we discussed Nazareth, the hometown of Jesus, and his reading in the synagogue that enraged the listeners so much so that they took him out of the city and tried to throw him off a cliff. We talked about the ancient city of Nazareth and how some believe that they have found the boyhood home of Jesus. We learned about a couple of important archaeological sites and what they can tell us about first century life for a Jewish family in Nazareth. Today, we look at the city Jesus called his hometown. That would be Capernaum, the town where Jesus launched his public ministry. The Gospels tell us that Jesus went to Capernaum after his temptation in the wilderness and after the arrest of John the Baptist. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 1, Matthew refers to Capernaum as Jesus' own city. And Matthew describes Jesus moved to Capernaum in chapter 4, and I quote, "When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali." Matthew then goes on to say this move was a fulfillment of a prophecy of Isaiah. And Matthew adds, "From that time Jesus began to preach, saying, 'Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.'" He then went about choosing his disciples from the surrounding region. The population of ancient Capernaum in the first century was primarily Jewish, but there was strong evidence of a multi-layered population, a mix that included mostly local Galilean Jews, but some Roman officials, perhaps some soldiers, a small contingent, and likely Gentile residents, artisans, or traders and such. During the time of Jesus, the ruler of Galilee, including Capernaum, which was on its edge, was Herod Antipas. He was the son of Herod the Great, and Herod Antipas held the title of Tetrarch, not a king, as was his father. And Herod Antipas ruled over the region of Galilee and Perea. Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John, four of Jesus' earliest disciples, were fishermen from this area. And fishing was a very common occupation among men who lived near the shore of the Sea of Galilee. This includes villages such as Capernaum, Bethsaida, Migdal, and Tiberias. We will explore the aspect of fishing and fishing boats later in this episode as we discuss an exciting archaeological discovery that was made in the summer of 1986. But first, welcome to the League of Biblical Enthusiasts. The Capernaum of today has not survived into a thriving modern city such as Nazareth, Tiberias, Bethlehem, or Jerusalem. The beautiful footage of the site that I'm showing now is from Eyal Asaf's YouTube channel, and I'll link to his site in the description below. Modern-day Capernaum is primarily a pilgrimage and tourist site for Christians and Jews who wish to see the ancient town as it has been preserved through archaeological excavations. Its Hebrew name is Kfar Nahum and is known in Arabic as Tel Hum. In 1838, American explorer Edward Robinson discovered ruins of the white limestone synagogue, but did not associate it with ancient Capernaum. It was in 1866 when British Captain Charles Wilson, working with the London-based Palestine Exploration Fund, first identified the site as biblical Capernaum. Soon, locals got wind of Wilson's discovery, and the Bedouins began a search for their own treasure and looting some of the area's rocks for other construction for themselves. They looted some ancient artifacts to sell to eager buyers in the growing antiquities market. So finally, in 1894, the Franciscan order named custodians of the Holy Land purchased the property to protect and preserve it. Their share of the land contains both the white limestone 5th century synagogue and the so-called House of Peter, just south of it. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem purchased land east of the Franciscan site in the early 20th century, and their site contains the modern Church of the 12 Apostles, built in 1931, and is located within the larger complex of the Greek Orthodox Monastery of the Holy Apostles. In the 1980s, the church was completely rebuilt, and it has distinctive bright red domes and white crosses. Now, to acquaint ourselves with the overall site within Israel, let's look at several visual references. First, we take a Google Earth descent to the Sea of Galilee, known today in Israel as Lake Kinneret. The lake has been called by different names throughout its history, depending on the dominant settlement on its shore. And with the changing fate of the towns, the lake's name also changed. In the Bible, it was known as the Sea of Kinneret. Luke calls it the Lake of Gennesaret, Gennesaret being a Hellenized form of Kinneret. In John 6, verse 1, we read, "After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. It was so named after Herod Antipas built his new capital, Tiberias, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee in 20 CE, and named it after the current emperor at the time, Tiberius, who was the second Roman emperor following Augustus." Now, the Sea of Galilee is the largest freshwater lake in Israel and is the lowest freshwater lake on Earth. It's approximately 33 miles in circumference, about 13 miles long, 7.5 miles wide, and an average depth of 141 feet. Capernaum sits on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. In the days in which Jesus was there, it had a population of roughly 1,500 or so, though some have estimated it larger. It's difficult to know an exact number. Archaeological excavations have revealed two ancient synagogues, one built on top of the other. The later one is from the 5th century, and the earlier synagogue is said to have been a 1st century synagogue, but this is contested at least by one notable archaeologist, namely Jody Magnus, and I've linked to her research in the description box. A Roman period house just south of the white limestone synagogue is believed by Christian tradition to have been the home of St. Peter, and of course where Jesus would have often stayed. Both the synagogue and the house are within the Franciscan portion of the town. Before we return to the archaeology of the site, let's review the political and cultural situation in Galilee in the 1st century. Capernaum was just inside the northern border of Galilee and was ruled by Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas was called by Jesus that fox. And it was that Herod who had John the Baptist beheaded at the encouragement of his wife. This did not endear him to the masses, many of whom respected John. Many Galileans were rural peasants, farmers, and fishermen who resented the heavy taxation and land exploitation. The region had a strong conservative religious identity centered on Jewish customs and the temple in Jerusalem, even though Galilee was culturally more mixed than Judea. Let's note that the Gospels mention of a Roman official in Capernaum and likely presence of a small military force there. Movements like the Zealots, Jews who opposed Roman rule, had roots in Galilee. Revolutionary sentiment simmered under the surface and would boil over later in the 1st century, leading to the first Jewish war with Rome, and of course with Rome sacking Jerusalem, destroying the temple, and changing their lives forever. Galilee was a culturally diverse region with influences from both Jewish tradition and Hellenistic practices. Cities like Sepphoris and Tiberias, both associated with Herod Antipas, became centers of economic activity and cultural exchange. The population included Jewish communities, Hellenized urban dwellers, and a mix of languages and customs. Now, what do the Gospels tell us about Capernaum and Jesus? Well, in Capernaum, Jesus calls his first disciples, quote, while walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, unquote. Simon and his brother Andrew, who were fishermen, were casting their nets into the sea. This is in Matthew 4 and Mark 1. A little farther up the shore, Jesus also calls James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were in a boat repairing their nets, also reported in Mark 1. Jesus called Matthew, a local tax collector who had an office or a booth, to follow him, Mark 2. He may have been taxing locals in the fishing industry. That would have made for an interesting conversation with his soon-to-be fellow brothers, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Luke tells us that Jesus often stays in Peter's house in Capernaum. Jesus teaches in the synagogue in Capernaum on the Sabbath, and the people were amazed at his teaching. This is Mark 1 and Luke 4. Jesus cast out an evil spirit from a man in the Capernaum synagogue, and word about him spreads throughout the region, Mark 4 and Luke 4. Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law in Peter's house, Matthew 8 and Luke 4. On the same day of that healing, Jesus heals many more people and drives out demons in Capernaum, keeping the demons silent because they recognized him, Matthew 8 and Luke 4. Jesus healed a paralyzed man who was lowered through the roof by his friends in Capernaum, Mark 2 and Luke 5. Jesus healed the servant of a Roman centurion. The word can also refer to a Roman official in Capernaum, remarking on his great faith, Matthew 8, Luke 7. Note especially that the Jews said, he loves the Jewish people and even built a synagogue for us. This is a most intriguing detail. Why would a Roman official finance a Jewish synagogue? Was he a closet God-fearer? Did he owe something to the Jews? Curious minds would like to know. And if you have thoughts, please share them with me. I'm completely open. After the wedding in Cana, Jesus, his mother Mary, his brothers, and disciples went to Capernaum and stayed for a few days, likely in Peter's house, John chapter 2. On another occasion, Jesus' mother and brothers came to Capernaum to see him, Mark 3. It was in the synagogue in Capernaum that Jesus taught about being the bread of life, John 6. Jesus healed both Jairus' daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage, likely in Capernaum, Matthew 9, Mark 5, and Luke 8. And note also that Jairus was the leader of the local synagogue. So we have several references to a synagogue in Capernaum. Jesus pronounced woes on Capernaum and other unrepentant cities due to their unbelief, even though they had witnessed his works, Matthew 11 and Luke 10. A crowd came to Capernaum looking for Jesus after he'd crossed the sea in John 6. And in John 6, he writes, the next day, the crowd that had stayed on the far shore saw that the disciples had taken the only boat, and they realized that Jesus had not gone with them. Several boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the Lord had blessed the bread and the people had eaten. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went across to Capernaum to look for him. Now understand this, boats were ubiquitous in that time all along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Fishing was an important industry and likely the main occupation of many men of Galilee and Capernaum. Tilapia was a common fish in the region and still is today. The town of Magdala, or Migdal, located on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, was a major center for sardine pickling and processing, suggesting they likely exported this abroad to other countries. Fermented fish sauce, known as garum, was a popular condiment in the Roman Empire. Evidence suggests that garum produced from the fish caught in the Sea of Galilee might have been exported to Rome and other locations. Parables and stories and sayings in the gospel frequently reference fishing, fishing nets, boats in the sea, reflecting Jesus' familiarity with this industry and his people. I wonder what a boat would have looked like, the one that Jesus and his disciples traveled in the first century. Well, wonder no more. Let's discuss the amazing discovery of the Jesus boat, also called the Galilean boat, found just 5 miles south of Capernaum. It was in Israel, along the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, during the summer of 1986. A severe drought occurred the previous year and was still on in 1986. The shores, the Sea of Galilee, and the waters were receding dramatically. Moshe and Yuval Lufan, two brothers from Kibbutz Gunasar, were exploring these newly exposed areas when they came across first some Roman coins, a little farther some Roman nails and more nails, and the thought occurred to them there must be wood nearby. Being amateur archaeologists, they had dreamed of making an important archaeological discovery on the Sea of Galilee. They soon became very excited because they saw an unmistakable outline of a boat that presented itself in the mud. They had just discovered a first century AD fishing boat, the kind that Jesus and his disciples would have known well. They rushed back to inform the head of the kibbutz, who then informed the Department of Antiquities. Maritime archaeologists and conservationists were called in to analyze the boat and how best to conserve it. They thought this was going to be an impossible recovery. All the odds were against them. The boat had to be carefully extracted quickly due to exposure to the air, return to the tide, and the changing conditions of the weather. Word spread quickly. Hundreds of people crowded the seaside, some to assist in the work, most of them just to watch. Vendors set up shop for the hungry and thirsty. TV crews from around the world covered the removal of the boat, which was ongoing day and night, 24 hours a day for 11 days. Finally, after 11 days of painstaking work, the boat was encased in polyurethane foam and floated to a conservation facility at the nearby Kibbutz Gunasar. The fragile and waterlogged wood required specialized preservation techniques. The boat was submerged in a chemical solution to prevent it from drying out and disintegrating. It would be 14 long years before it could be shown to the public. There are some fascinating videos describing this whole scenario, and I've linked to them in the description. They are well worth your time. Today, the boat is on display at the Yigal Allon Center in Gunasar, Israel. And here's a picture that I took beside the boat on a trip in October 2018. The boat measures 27 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, could hold 12, 13 or so people, and was determined through radiocarbon dating to be from the first century. A cooking pot and oil lamp were found inside that corroborated this dating. Did Jesus and his disciples use this very boat? Probably not. But was it much like the boat that Jesus and his disciples knew and traveled in? Without a doubt, absolutely yes. I like the story of Jesus calming the storm in the Sea of Galilee. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all describe it. Only Mark has this little detail, and let's read it. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And here's the detail. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. You know, you have to be really, really tired to sleep during a storm in the open waters on a boat. Some have said that the Sea of Galilee doesn't have serious storms, and this story is just an invention of Mark for dramatic effect to highlight Jesus' power. Normally, the Sea of Galilee is a very calm lake, but storms have occurred, and when they do, can develop quickly. Not every month, perhaps not every year, but they do happen and can be frightening if you're caught on one of these storms in the middle of the lake. Just take a look at a couple of storms that were recorded near Capernaum, the first filmed in 2021 and a previous one in March 1992. The footage is from the YouTube channel Sergio and Rhoda in Israel. Link in the description box. Now, what about the first century synagogue and Peter's house? Let's briefly review them and then we'll be done. When the white limestone synagogue was first excavated by the Franciscan friar Gaudentius Orfali in the 1920s, he identified it as the synagogue in which Jesus had preached and performed miracles. A little premature. Today, all competent archaeologists reject this dating for the synagogue. In 1968, the Franciscans renewed their excavations in the synagogue under the direction of two Franciscan father scholars, Virgilio Corva and Stanislao Lofreda. This pair of Italian scholars concluded the synagogue dated to the 4th or 5th century AD. Their dating was based not in part on a hoard of 10,000 or more coins they found under the synagogue floor. Beneath the foundation of the white limestone synagogue lies another foundation made of black basalt, stone which is local to the region. And Lofreda suggests this is the foundation of a synagogue from the 1st century, perhaps the one mentioned in the Gospels. The idea is that the later synagogue was built directly on top of the earlier one, preserving the sacred space. Reasons supporting this identification include the principle of continuity of cult, that is, religious buildings preserving memory of another being built on top of an earlier one. However, this interpretation is not persuasive to everyone. Some suggest that the basalt pavement under the white limestone synagogue might have been an open market rather than the 1st century synagogue floor. And the large size proposed for the potential 1st century synagogue seems inconsistent with the modest nature of the earlier or the 1st century structures found at the site. So, there's the debate. Then we have the so-called Peter's house, just 85 feet south of the 5th century synagogue. The Franciscan archaeologists believe they discovered the remains of a 1st century house, and they argue it's the house where the Apostle Peter lived. That would be the same house where Jesus would have stayed and Peter's mother-in-law was healed. They claim to have found 3 structural remains from 3 different building periods. A 1st century house, which was later enlarged and became a house church, in Latin known as Domus Ecclesia. Then in the 4th century, the building was enclosed by a high-walled square precinct. And finally, in the 5th century, an octagonal church was built over both earlier structures to commemorate the site as Peter's house. Now, like many finds from archaeology, the evidence can be interpreted in more than one way, and not all agree this site was the 1st century house occupied by Peter. But in their favor, the Franciscans point to the octagonal shape of the church as proof of the structure being a commemorative church. It is consistent with other Christian sites which preserve a memory of early Christianity. For example, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem was built in an octagonal form by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. The Franciscans also point to early Christian graffiti made by pilgrims visiting the site as evidence it commemorates Peter's house. And here I'm showing 3 plans that have been drawn up to represent the 3 stages of this site. First, the original 1st century house. And second, the 4th century enlarged house church. And third, the octagonal structure surrounding the site to commemorate it. Now, a modern church has been built on top of all of these with a glass floor so that visitors can see the remains beneath it. Tradition is on the side of the Franciscan archaeologists. Near the end of the 4th century, a Spanish nun named Agaria visited the site and reported in her diary that she had seen the house of St. Peter, which had been turned into a church. A similar report appears in the anonymous 6th century AD Italian traveler known as the Pilgrim of Piacenza. The note reads, "We came to Capernaum to the house of St. Peter, which is now a basilica or a church." Did the Franciscans find the 1st century house of Peter? For some, the question is still open. Others believe that the circumstantial evidence is strong in favor of Peter's house. Perhaps definitive proof will be forthcoming with future excavation work. What we can know for sure is this. Number one, 1st century structures were found at Capernaum, and their construction is consistent with what we already know of the buildings from that time and place. 2, the two primary sites in question, that being the synagogue, the white limestone synagogue, and the building beneath it, and the 1st century house of Peter, are in ancient Capernaum, as described in the Gospels. 3rd, the Galilean boat, or Jesus boat, is a 1st century boat. It is the kind of boat that Jesus and his disciples would have traveled on the Sea of Galilee, and from which Peter, Andrew, James, and John would have used for fishing and casting their nets. Right time, right place. Well, there is much more to the archaeological site of Capernaum that we cannot cover in this episode. I have provided for you many links to books, research papers, journals, interviews with principals, videos, etc., which will occupy your time for hours on end should you go there. And I recommend you check out the various sources in the description box. If you have insights on this episode, I would love to read about it. Please comment and give me your thoughts. And if you like our content, please like, share with like-minded friends, and subscribe to the channel. In addition, you may be seeing advertisements, and I would like to know your thoughts about them. I'm not clear how many, their duration, and if you can skip over them. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm eager to get some feedback on this. I hope this has been informative and helpful to you. I encourage you, return to the Gospels and read again all that Jesus said and did in his own city, Capernaum. Our next episode will continue this series, Cities of the New Testament, that city yet to be determined. The next episode may take a couple of weeks to complete since I will be out of town, taking a break, but be assured, mid-May, a little later, we will resume. Until then, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise, and we'll see you in the next episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts.